You are listening to the Vincast, Australia's only podcast dedicated to the world of wine. If you've only recently discovered the show, then you can actually listen to any of the 100 plus episodes that are still available on the Vincast page on iTunes. I've interviewed some of the most amazing people involved in the wine industry today, and they've shared their stories, philosophies, and their projects with me. Going to iTunes and subscribing means you're going to get the newest episodes as soon as it becomes available. And it's also a fantastic way to provide myself, potential listeners, and most importantly, potential guests some feedback. The feedback is provided by leaving a 5-star rating and a review. And as mentioned on previous episodes, if you mentioned one of your favorite episodes and then get in contact with me, you can receive a beautiful watercolor wine map of the Yarra Valley wine region made by Linus Wilson from Wines and Makers. I'd also like to encourage you to visit me on YouTube at the Intrepid Wino, one word, YouTube channel. And you can check out some of the videos that I've posted, including over 100 editions of Let's Taste, and also my awesome Intrepid Winemaking Sangiovese project in 2016. Thanks very much, guys, for your support, and I hope you enjoy this week's episode. On episode 105 of the Vincast, I chat with cult wine producer based in northern Tasmania, Joe Holyman from Stoney Rise Wines. Hello there, Vincasters. Welcome to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and as always, thank you very much for joining us. I've got a really awesome guest for this episode. I've been trying to get him on the show for a while now. He's definitely been someone I've wanted to chat to ever since I started the show. I think I met him not long before I started it, when he was showing his wines down at Prince Wine Store in South Melbourne. A guy by the name of Joe Holyman, who is a really amazing wine producer, making some of the best Chardonnay and Pinot Noir in Tasmania, if not Australia, and has a really wonderful background in the wine industry, and also has a lot of respect from sommeliers and wine writers and the like. So I was really excited to chat with him whilst he was here in Melbourne recently, and find out more about his background. So please stick around to the end of the episode so you can find out how to get in touch with both of us. But until then, I'll see you on the other side. Joe, thank you very much for making some time in your schedule whilst you're here in Melbourne. Maybe you brought the weather with you. We've had a lovely rainy afternoon. Thank you very much for that.
Pleasure. You can have some of ours.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, you guys have been having a bit of drought problems of late, haven't you?
Drought over summer, but
Yeah.
it hasn't really stopped raining much since.
Okay, well, that's good. But thank you and welcome on the podcast. I typically start every episode by asking my guest if they can remember whether there was an incident in their life that made them think about wine in a different way, that possibly started them on the path to a wine career, or was it more of a gradual thing?
This is an interesting question, because I have a thought on this, but my family tell me completely differently. But I grew up in a family that liked wine. My father had a bit of a thing for it. Mm-hmm. And when I was about 14, so in 1984, my father planted a 0.6 of a hectare vineyard in Launceston. So he had a hobby as such.
Right. Was he a professional of some sort?
He worked for a family business, a family transport business. So
yeah, okay.
That went for a long time. But I have this memory of, I think I was probably about 13 or 14. Mm-hmm. And a friend of my father's, and he had got together and bought a bottle of must have been 1971, maybe 1970 Shadow of Chem,
Wow.
with the idea that they'd always share it together. And this friend of his had plans to plant a vineyard in the Tamar, which was called St Matthias, which is now owned by Marilla. And we were on the east coast of Tasmania at their shack, and I still remember tasting that wine now, but having a little sip as a young kid, I guess, and just sort of the intensity, and there was something about that sort of piqued my interest.
Then you were able to get past just the sweetness and enjoying that part. You actually saw a lot more to the wine.
I think so. I think as a kid, you probably see the sweetness and like the sweetness and think, well, if all wine tastes like this, I like it. But I think there must have been something that happened for me to remember it, because there's a whole lot of stuff between that incident and now that I don't remember. So there must have been something in that moment.
So that's your theory?
Yeah.
What's your family's theory?
My family's theory, they find it hard to believe that I remember that point, and that's what they think, that's why I think I had some interest in wine.
Right, okay.
So the event occurred, but our sort of understanding of what reference it had to where I am now is probably a bit different.
They kind of think of it, and they're like, they're not that surprised. It's like, well, we kind of, you sort of had some interest in wine. You were interested in what we were doing as far as planting the vineyard. Was this about the same time as your father was planting the vineyard?
It would have been pretty close, maybe a little bit before then.
Right, okay. Interesting. Did they drink a lot of wine at home in general?
They had, yeah, we did. We always had wine, and that's the other sort of thing. You know, I sort of have this memory of the old, European ideal of, or story of, young children having a little sip of wine with some water in the glass with every meal, or so it sort of, I guess, it grew from there. And my father, a part of the transport business, he shipped a lot of wine around, I guess, and so he. There was always wine on the table,
right?
And he had friends interested in wine, so we'd get together. And I guess as I got a bit older, whenever he drank quite a lot of European wine.
Okay.
At the time, because it was sort of reasonably priced and easy to get.
Yeah. And there wasn't, heaps and heaps of Australian wine that was really easily accessible at that time. The big plantings was starting to happen a lot more in the 80s.
Yeah, I think so. I think it helped that he had an interest, so he wanted to find out what else was happening in the world with wine as well.
Yeah.
And it just sort of grew from there. If he opened a bottle of European wine and I wanted to try it, then he got a book out and said, well, you better read about it before you try it.
Wow,
learn
okay.
something about it.
Sure.
So it was sort of an educational experience at the same time.
Yeah, okay. So you were born and grew up in Tassie, in Launceston?
Yeah, grew up in Launceston, and left, I guess, when I left home when I was about 17, but lived in Hobart, so not too far, but far enough, and then moved back 12 years ago. So I had about sort of 12, 15 years away.
Okay.
Yeah.
What took you to Hobart?
I actually went to Hobart to play cricket.
Really?
Yeah, so sort of...
Were you a bowler or a batsman or a wicketkeeper?
I was a wicketkeeper.
Okay.
Yeah, and I sort of had an agreement with my father that if I did well in my HSC, as it was back in those days, I would go to England and play cricket.
The county cricket?
No, just club cricket.
Just club cricket?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the following year I promised to go back to university, and I went to university to do a business degree for about 6 weeks.
Okay.
Had a little bit of a side swipe, and we just sort of went off on a different tangent for a while, and I decided to go to Hobart and actually take my cricket seriously, and did that.
And were you working there as well whilst you were playing?
Yeah, I ended up. I did a couple of things. The guy who initially wanted me to go to Hobart to play cricket for his club had a concreting business,
right?
Which sort of worked okay. I'd get up at 6 in the morning, or he'd pick me up at 6. We'd go and pour concrete for house slabs
Yep.
And I'd be finished by 1 or 2 in the afternoon, which meant I could get to training. So
Yeah,
I was sort of fitted in. And then as I got sort of deeper into cricket, that wasn't sort of necessarily physically great for me to be pouring concrete all day and then trying
It'd
to
be pretty hard on
train.
the back and the knees, probably.
Yeah, it was okay. It was probably good exercise, but at the time it seemed, I was sort of double working every day.
Yeah, physically you would have been pretty wrecked.
Yeah, so I ended up strangely enough, with a job in a bottle shop.
Yeah, okay.
So so I've sort of, I guess, I previously worked in the industry. I worked in what was a reasonably well-known restaurant in Launceston called Quigley's when I was still at school, and I think I was 15.
Right.
And I was the wine waiter because I knew more about wine in the restaurant than anyone else.
Now, I know the statute of limitations is probably well and truly gone, but was that legal at the time for
I don't
15,
know.
16 to be serving booze?
It's just the way it worked. I think,
That was the norm.
Yeah.
Oh,
well,
cool.
I don't know whether it was a norm,
But it was accepted.
yeah, no one really seemed to care. The
Okay.
owners were Italian, and they just seemed to, it was a normal thing. As long
Sure.
as someone knew what they were doing, it was okay.
Okay. And as far as wine being produced in Tassie, was there much going on down there at that point? Bits and pieces. There were certain areas of Tassie, or was there a lot going on in particular areas?
Not really. I mean, obviously, by then you're looking at sort of late 60s, early 70s when Piper's Brook and Heemskirk were planted.
Sure.
Heemskirk at the time, which is now Jants.
Which that's still quite a while ago. When you look at a lot of regions on mainland Australia that really only started to get planted seriously in the 80s, 90s.
Yeah, and it was a reasonable volume of planting they did.
Okay.
They didn't sort of just do a couple of hectares here and there.
Mm-hmm.
There was a little bit going on in that sort of size level back then, where there was the odd hectare, a few people toying with the idea. Marilla had obviously been planted, I think that was the late 50s.
Right.
And then there was the vineyard at Lilydale that was planted in the late 50s.
Mm-hmm.
And then sort of a little bit, it was a bit of a gap, I guess, until sort of the early 80s when you've got things like Holm Oak, Rotherhithe Vineyard, which we now own,
Right.
Racenay, and some of those, and then into the early 90s when some of the, quite big plantings, like for Tasmania at the time, Strathlin, which is called Ninth Island.
Sure.
So it sort of grew from there, but yeah,
And it was about that time that there were vineyards being planted to sell fruit rather than just to make their own wine. They would because I know, having worked for Chandon, they would source some of their best quality fruit for their sparkling wines from Tasmania. And I'm just interested to know, as other regions around Australia started to get planted with the idea of selling fruit, did that start to happen in Tassie in that kind of period?
No, I think in the early days when you've got Marilla, Heemskirk, and of course the Jants label was started back in the early 90s.
Yeah.
With the Rodra connection.
Yeah.
Pipers, they were actually all growing grapes to make wine.
Okay.
And it sort of...
So it was right in the heavy boom that a lot more planting started to come in.
Yeah, but I still think if you look at the industry in Tassie, there's not, percentage-wise, there's a very small percentage of people that just grow grapes.
Right, okay.
Quite a lot of people actually, whether someone else makes it or they only make enough to sell to their friends, or there's very few that I know of. There's very few growers as such, and as the popularity's grown of the island and the wines, it's becoming less and less.
Yeah, okay.
It's becoming harder to find people that are purely just growers.
In that period, it probably would have been a little bit more of larger wine companies either buying into it or, it being like Hardy's, for example, using high quality fruit for some of their multi-regional icon blends, or making wines exclusively from Tassie, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that's become, probably in the last sort of 15 years, that's become much more of the norm. And I guess I can't remember how old the Toll Puddle is. It's 20 years old maybe.
Yeah.
Where Chandon
Yeah.
planted, and a few of those vineyards like where Bay of Fires is now. That people, there was a bit more buying and selling of fruit.
Right.
Bit of swapping, I think, probably. You know, I can't grow this here, so you grow it, and I'll give you a bit of that. And
All right. Okay.
it's all a fairly friendly industry down there.
Yeah.
So, but I guess the real boom's only really happened in the last 10 years,
Yeah.
where there's just, a demand that is, not unsustainable, that's the wrong word, it's unfulfillable.
Right. Okay. I mean, this image of Tasmania being a premium wine producing region, and I mean, we're talking about an island that has a lot of sub-regions, and the image, well, particularly as cool climate has become sort of more important in the eyes of the consumer, and Tasmania being considered to be one of the coolest climate, if not the coolest climate for Australian wine. I would think that probably has had a big impact. And do you think there's a lot of tourism to Tasmania that are looking for that kind of thing, like vino, tourism kind of thing?
Yeah, definitely. We're probably seeing more people come into Celador and stuff that are on a weekend.
Right.
Small groups, 2 couples, 3 couples travelling together who get together once a year and they visit a wine region. Or we did Hobart last year, so we're doing the Tamar Valley this year. And
yeah,
there's definitely more of that. I think there's more people in general coming because of the food wine thing that's going on in Tassie.
Mm-hmm.
And it continues to grow, I think. I think that's the thing at the moment, and that's why some of these growers, former growers, are now making wine and setting up cellar doors, because there's just a constant stream of people.
I know when I was down in Hobart earlier this year, I had discussions about the lack of accommodation. Then places get booked up, and it's sort of like, and when there's big events on like Dark Mofo or something like that, it can be pretty hard to get a room.
Yeah, Hobart's amazing. It's especially not that living in Launceston, I don't often have to book a room in Launceston, so
yeah,
I don't really know. But Hobart definitely, the times that I go down there, stay with friends a lot. But if I need a room, it's actually quite hard to get one.
Yeah,
there are a lot of conferences.
Yeah.
A lot more constant tourism than Launceston, in that I think for some people believe that because it's a capital city, there's more to do there, or you can go there any time of the year.
Yeah.
But where Launceston has a little dip,
Sure.
weather-wise.
Yeah.
Not weather-wise, because I'd much rather have summer in Launceston than summer in Melbourne, and I've lived in both, so
Okay.
have some experience. Sorry, not summer, winter.
Yeah.
I meant to say.
Yeah.
So I just think in general there's more people around
Yeah. Okay.
in Tassie at the moment. Yeah.
So, what was it that took you off the island?
When my 6 weeks in my business degree, I realised I didn't like accounting.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't like law,
Mm.
which sort of cuts out of most of a business degree.
Yeah.
But I quite like the marketing aspect and the sales and marketing side that we did, little bits that I was there for.
Yeah.
And I found out through a friend about the marketing diploma at Roseworthy.
Oh, okay.
So I went off and did that.
Ah, okay.
After a while, I did it. I started externally. Went full-time after 6 months and only lasted a year, and then I moved to Melbourne. But I finished the course, and that sort of, that's how I sort of got into the industry, I guess.
How did you find the experience studying at Roseworthy? Of course, I mean, I know because I studied with Adelaide Uni, but it's sort of been consolidated into the Wade campus now. But how did you find it? Because Roseworthy, correct me if I'm wrong, is in the Barossa Valley?
Basically, yeah.
Pretty much,
So just out of Gawler.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, it was already owned
By the uni.
by the uni by then, but we still did. I think I can't remember the second year, the last bit of my second year. I think was the last year they did it at Roseworthy, and then they moved it all to Wait.
Yeah.
That was a fantastic experience. Living in the country, we had a swimming pool, bar, football team, tennis courts. It was like a bit like Club Med up in the Barossa.
It's a bit warmer than Tassie.
Bit warmer than Tassie, and just met a lot of nice people. Met a few people from the industry, and still friends with quite a few of them. And it was a great experience, great way. I mean, this is 1993, and the industry was. I mean, it's still a small industry relative, but it was a much smaller industry in 1993 than it is now.
But was there at the time a bit of investment, like they were kind of promoting degrees, winemaking degrees, wine marketing degrees, because they kind of foresaw that there would be more need for wine professionals as the Australian wine industry grew and grew?
I didn't notice that. I think, my reasoning, I got offered a job here in Melbourne as a rep through some unpaid work experience. And my experience of being an external student and doing residentials where there was 30 or 40 people in the group in my year.
Yeah.
Some of them, sure, probably already had family businesses or had some relationship to the industry and were just doing their study.
Yeah.
But then I went internal and there was 30 people doing the marketing degree internally. And I would suggest that in 1993, if you looked up the archives, there was probably about 2 marketing jobs advertised every year in the wine industry.
Right, okay.
So, and that's why I took the job when the job was offered, because I sort of realised that you have very few of the people that I was at uni with were probably going to end up in the wine industry.
I suppose the concept of wine marketing, as crazy as it sounds, was still kind of a bit new. I think, what we think of as wine marketing, which is just sort of communication, knowing your story and fairly strong branding, is something that's been around for hundreds of years. But this new concept of wine marketing and public relations and that sort of thing was fairly new at that time.
Oh, definitely. You went to Rockford in the Barossa, and a lady called Jane Ferrari, who I don't know whether you've ever met.
I have met her.
You should meet.
Obviously, I've met her and I've invited her on the podcast. But she does travel a lot.
She does travel a lot.
She travels a lot.
But she was doing wine marketing in 1993 that most wineries in Australia still don't do, and that was that she told a story about everything.
Yeah.
And if you walked in the cellar door there could be a piece of wood on the windowsill, and she'd have a story about why that piece of wood was there. Even if there was no interest in the story, she'd still tell you the story. And those guys, the iconic, some of the iconic brands of Australia, like Rockford and St Hallett, Old Block, and all those wines, they didn't need to market themselves.
No, they, without realising it, they were doing a perfectly good job.
They were doing it really well without realising it, but they just didn't need to do anything. So, and it was, I think, in a stage in the industry when, because there wasn't as many brands, there was a bit more, I hate to use the word loyalty, but it's sort of a bit more loyalty in the trade for certain brands, where now there's so many options for people that
it's so competitive.
That's changed a bit. Yeah, it's much more competitive, and that side of things has changed a bit.
So you came in and started working as a rep in Melbourne. How did you find that experience?
I did a year here, and I was the new rep on the block for the company. So my territory was pretty much everywhere where no one else wanted to go.
Yeah.
So it went as far as Apollo Bay and Colac and Bendigo, Ballarat.
Okay.
Not that people didn't want to go there; they just didn't have time to some of those places. But
so you would have racked up a few clicks in the car.
I did a fair few kilometres, which was cool. I had the Great Ocean Road, so drive along the Great Ocean Road once a month or once every 6 weeks, and
not the worst commute in the world.
No, and I had a friend in Robe in South Australia who I'd met at Roseworthy, so I used to do the Great Ocean Road on a Friday and come back through Colac and Geelong and stuff on a Monday. So
yeah, nice.
So it's sort of so that side of it was really cool. But then I got moved to Sydney. And then I went from doing the Great Ocean Road and northern and western suburbs of Melbourne to the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, of Sydney. Sorry.
Bit of a
and
change
that
of
was
pace.
a slight change of pace. Yeah. So
the slightly more affluent part of Sydney.
yeah,
Yeah.
just a different beast, really.
Yeah.
But the sort of hook to go was I got more involved in the imported wines that the distributor was selling, and sort of got to travel a little bit around Sydney, sort of acting as not really a consultant, but helping out people to learn a bit more about imported wine. And
so
that sort of thing.
you took that opportunity to, like, they kind of saw Joe knows a bit more about wines and imported wines. He's a good person for us to sort of specialised accounts that need a little bit more attention with that kind of thing. We'll send him there, that kind of thing.
I think so. Yeah, there was a bit of that, and obviously, in the eastern suburbs of Sydney is probably where most of those clients would have been based.
Sure.
But then, there was definitely restaurants, in North Sydney and beyond that, that were buying those wines. It was just about trying to grow that sort of market at the time a little bit as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
At this period in time, did you find yourself connecting with particular wines, and did you find did your palate evolve quite a lot in that period?
Yeah, it evolved quite quickly, I think.
Yeah.
While I was at Roseworthy, I worked at what was Bailey and Bailey, which is a group of stores privately owned at the time. And there was a store at St George's in Adelaide that was arguably one of the best bottle shops in Australia.
Wow.
And that was part of so I worked there a bit and worked at a couple of their other stores.
Mm-hmm.
They were bought by Woolworths sort of back in about maybe early 2000s,
Mm-hmm.
I think. And the first case of wine I ever bought with my own money was a case of 1990 Black Label Cabernet
From
Wins.
Wins, yeah.
And then in my early days with the distribution business, I bought some Mondavi Cabernet, and I had a bit of a thing for Cabernet, I think, at the time.
Yeah.
And I think in those sort of 3 or 4 years doing that job and subsequent jobs shortly after that I probably drank more Cabernet than I've drunk since.
Really?
So, it just evolved by tasting, and, I think your palate evolves all the time.
Sure.
I think it changes.
There is a greatness to Cabernet, which I think it's easy to latch onto when you are starting to get a lot more interested in wine. And then I think people kind of evolve away from it, possibly. Always knowing, some of the great wines of the world are Cabernet based, but then they kind of have a affinity with Pinot or Italian varieties, that kind of thing.
Yeah, look, I'm hoping that I don't go back to that, James, personally, but I understand. I just think, I think your tastes change. I think,
but I look at my cellar, like back when I started to trawl through the Langton's auctions, and looking at their classifications, trying to work out what was considered to be great wines and age-worthy wines, and I look in my cellar and there's still plenty of Cabernets in there, and don't get me wrong, they're great wines, but now I very rarely will go towards a Cabernet. It's just I don't find them as compelling as a lot of other varieties out there.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, and I know that in my game of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, especially Pinot though, people always talk about how hard it is to find good ones, or good ones at a price point, or whatever the beef may be. I would argue that Cabernet's even harder.
Okay.
I mean, great Cabernet's amazing, and it's one of the great wines of the world.
Yeah.
But I went through a stage of struggling to find something I liked, and
okay. So even then, you like, stylistically, you had a particular preference.
Yeah, I think so. As I say, I think my palate moved away from that, and I don't know. I probably moved further away from it now, and probably continue to move further away from. I guess I grew up when going back to the original thing. Food, wine was a food item almost. You only ever had it, and I still, within reason, only really drink wine when I eat, a majority of it. And I don't eat food that goes with Cabernet.
Yeah.
I eat a lot of sort of Asian style food or Italian food, and you really want Italian wine, or you want Riesling, or something that's going to go with those foods. Mm-hmm. And so I think you get drawn away from that relative to your food preference a bit as well.
I find it is very hard to, Cabernets typically they don't have that freshness to them that, like, between a mouthful of food, get your palate excited for the next mouthful. The Cabernet really needs something very, very robust to match with it. And I'm the same. I rarely have steak anymore. I mean, that's partly a product of living with the vegetarian, but that's another discussion.
Yeah, and I'd just like to cut us off there and just say that I've just spoken more about Cabernet in the last few minutes than I ever plan to again. So can we move on?
Yeah, well, if you want, I can edit this entire section of the conversation out. So how long were you in Sydney for, and what were what was the next stage in your wine career?
I had 3 years in Sydney. Mm-hmm. 3 years repping in Sydney.
Yep.
And then I got a job as the buyer, or one of the buyers, at the Wine Society.
Okay. What can you explain to the
Wine Society?
The very last episode, I was talking with Jane Thompson, right, and she mentioned the Wine Society, and we couldn't quite work out exactly how it works.
So the Wine Society is a buying. It's almost like a buying group, I guess.
Okay.
But it's a direct mail business.
Right.
50,000. Well, when I worked there, I don't know what it is now.
Sure.
Could be more, could be less. At the time, there was around about 50,000 members.
Around Australia,
and you used to put $50 in for your membership.
Per year?
No, $50 was your membership.
Right.
And if you ever wanted to pull your membership, you got your $50 back. So I don't know how, there must have been a legality as to why, I can't really remember.
Oh, okay.
But I can't remember I can't remember all the figures, but it's a pretty big direct mail business.
Right.
It was.
So it's $50 membership, and then you buy wine.
Yeah, and then you can choose to buy individual wines. So they produce a pamphlet.
Yeah.
We used to do a little one a month, and then 4 big ones or something
a year. Right. Okay. And well, what she talked about was like her father being a member of that, and you getting a mixed dozen or something like that, and it was like Christmas, and you open up, oh, what have I got this month?
Pretty much. We this was 1999 roundabout, give or take. I think we had a dozen that was $120.
So not that expensive.
Not very expensive. And then we had a dozen, I think we may have got up around $350.
Okay.
That went out. You signed up. You could sign up to them to come 3 or 4 times a year.
Yep. Just sort of like what sort of wineries have started to get as far as your membership, and we'll send you out a bottle of each of the new releases as we release them throughout the year, that kind of thing.
Very much so, yeah. So,
yeah, okay.
Yeah, constant supply of wine would save you going to the shop if you didn't want to.
Okay.
So I did that for a year, and then, funnily enough, just for I'll say it one more time, I sold all my Cabernet to my father and one of his friends, and went to Portugal and did vintage.
Wow, you must have amassed a decent collection to be able to have funded your trip over.
I might have probably inflated the prices a bit because it was my father. Maybe. Okay. I don't know.
Again, statute of limitations.
Yeah.
And why Portugal?
Because I resigned from my job in sort of the middle of June.
Yep.
Early June.
Yep.
And I knew that I wanted to go. That's what I wanted to do, is to go and do vintage and start back down the sort of more wine focused path.
Had you had any experience winemaking at that point?
Only family wise, and I did a vintage in New Zealand in 2008, and sort of bits and pieces. So not a huge experience, but I knew.
Sorry, 2008 or 98?
Sorry, 98.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm good with numbers. That's why I'm not allowed to touch the money.
Yes.
So I'd had a flirt with it, I guess, but I just knew deep down that maybe, if I hadn't gone down the cricket path, I probably should have done something else, winemaking or
Yep.
viticulture or
Yep.
something many years before that.
Yep.
And my boss at the time knew people, and he said, what are you going to do? And I said, I want to go to Europe and do vintage, but I'm going to struggle. And he said, I'll make some calls. And the next day when I handed my official letter of resignation in, he said, you start in Portugal on the 8th of August. So it wasn't necessarily a go to Portugal. I'm really happy I did, and I'd love to go back again.
Yeah.
Not necessarily for vintage, just to visit, because it's such a beautiful place.
It is. Beautiful people.
Yeah. But that was just available to me at the time, and it was an easy solution.
Yeah, okay. And so, I mean, apart from New Zealand, that was your first winemaking experience overseas as well. Well,
Yeah. So
coincidentally as well.
Yeah, so I was the night shift manager for the biggest winery that was owned by Taylor Fonseca.
Yeah.
And we made 2 million litres of port, and I had just completely had no idea how busy I was going to be doing that.
Yeah. When you think about the market for fortified wines around the world, it's amazing that one winery can make 2 million litres of port.
For the supermarkets.
Yeah.
In the UK.
A lot to the UK, yeah. And how did you start to, think about coming back to Tasmania and starting your own project? I'm hitting the fast forward button a little bit there.
Yeah, no, that's cool. So I just a brief sort of fill in a couple of years that when I left Sydney, I went back to my friend in Robe who had a winery.
Yep.
Has a winery still, and said, well, I'm going to work in a winery. I better remember how to use pumps and stuff. So I went and did
Which direction to turn?
Yeah. Went and did 8 weeks with him, and then based myself in Robe for basically, it was 3.5 years in the end.
Right.
Working in the winery for vintage a bit, helping him with sales and marketing a bit, and slowly my involvement with his business became more sales and marketing than working in the winery, helping them out.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, a friend and I, who happened to turn up in Robe as well, we're from Tassie, decided to make some wine together. Mm-hmm. And we sort of grew from there, I guess, the brand, Stoney Rise brand. And then a few years down the track, my phone call with my father telling me about pulling out his 25-year-old vineyard.
Yeah. And
my wife, now wife, and I said, well, we're buying grapes. We're using someone else's winery.
Yeah.
It'd be a bit of a waste to pull it out. We'll come back to Tassie, but we have to buy something else. And in the throes of doing all of that, Dad sold the family farm, but we'd bought this new property, or new old property, new to us.
Right. Okay. So what? So you bought a vineyard that obviously had already been planted, and you were establishing a new kind of wine business. What were some of the first decisions you made? Did you make many changes in the vineyard? What did you have an idea about the kind of wines you maybe wanted to make?
Not really. Obviously wanted to make Pinot and Chardonnay, and that was really the focus of going back to Tassie.
Right.
But the style of the wine, or the wines, not really. It was about, to me, reasonably inexperienced, really, when I look back. Well, I know I was very inexperienced in some of this. It was more about the vineyard initially. The vineyard was a bit dilapidated, so we're still fixing it 12 years later. There's some parts of it that we haven't quite fixed yet.
Sure.
Variety-wise, there was 0.8 of a hectare of Cabernet, and we pruned it with an excavator and replanted it with Pinot.
Yeah.
So there was no other real aspiration. We were lucky enough at the time to be the first people in Australia to have access to Gruner Veltliner, so we planted a small sort of 900 vines of that. Mm-hmm. Took some Chardonnay out. Hindsight, not the greatest decision I've ever made, but the Gruner's great. I mean, we make about 100 cases a year. It's quite good fun,
I'm sure you don't have too many issues selling that one. And
No, not really.
Grün is
We keep it pretty much all for cellar-door these days.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. And
I would have thought Melbourne sommeliers would be beating down your door, desperate to get some. No?
no, not really.
a
mean,
shame.
it's a bit of a quirky wine. It's my little fun sort of toy because we don't make very much of it, so I muck around with it a bit. And
Yeah.
one of them went a bit pet nat in the bottle, and people thought that was a bit freaky. And so it's been a bit of a sort of work in progress. I think the current one, the new one, is probably the best one we've made. It's the most Gruner-like Gruner we've made.
Yeah.
And then 3 years ago, nearly 3 years ago, we bought a bit of land next door and planted 3 more hectares.
There you go.
So we've got 7 in total at the moment.
Okay.
95% of that's Pinot as well. So, I think we've now got basically got 6 hectares of Pinot, 3/4 of a hectare of Chardonnay, and 0.2 of a hectare of Gruner.
Mm. So the Stoney Rise story didn't start in Tasmania. Have I got that right?
Yeah, the Stoney Rise story started in Robe.
Right.
And we started the brand, and my friend and I were buying fruit and making the wine at someone else's winery, and we sort of sat around and said, what are we going to do if we sell it? What are we going to call it? And he said, we both sort of looked at each other and said, well, we spend a lot of time at Stoney Rise surfing.
Okay.
And it sort of stuck. But when we moved back to Tassie, because the vineyard we bought, we didn't buy the name, we decided to keep using the Stoney Rise name because we had some sort of brand awareness.
Yeah, okay.
That meant rather than starting with a brand new thing, people would drive along the road and go, Stoney Rise, I've heard of them, let's go up there.
Okay.
So it was a bit of a trick marketing. So, and strangely, the whole brand's upside down. The Holyman wines are 100% estate grown from the Stoney Rise vineyard, but the Stoney Rise wines have brought in fruit in them.
Right.
Or some of them do. So,
and did you built your own winery?
Yeah, we bought the property in 2004.
Yep.
Built the winery in 2008.
Right.
So we had we didn't take the 2004 vintage, so we had 5, 6, and 7 we made at Tamer Ridge.
Yep.
And then from 8 onwards, we do all of it ourselves,
right.
Except bottling.
Yeah. What is? Do you have a kind of a philosophy as to how you work in the vineyard? Do you try to intervene as little as possible?
Yeah, look, it's all evolving, I think, still. And the deeper I get into, the longer I'm in it, the more it evolves in a funny sort of way, rather than sort of. So winemaking wise, there's no additions other than sulphur.
Yep.
But we do use sulphur and don't have a problem with that. I think, and in a general sense, the philosophy for me is what the French basically call lutte raisonnée, which basically means you do everything for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have another vintage like 2011 and the only way to save your crop is spray chemicals, then you spray them.
Sure.
If you don't have to spray them, you don't spray them.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, we really concentrate on controlling what we can control.
Yep.
So we don't use herbicides or pesticides.
Yeah.
Because we can do that another way. We don't have a lot of trouble with pests, but especially the herbicides, we use an undivine weeder, and that's just what we do.
Mm-hmm.
No man-made fertilisers. So every year we put a temporary fence around the vineyard and get 100 sheep in, and that's the only fertiliser we use, except for compost and
effective lawnmowers as well.
Yeah. The funny thing is that you need to get them out about. They've been out a little while this year because we borrow them. So whenever the farmer wants them back, we have to give them back.
Yeah.
But they normally come to us newly pregnant, and so they sort of move about 5 or 6 weeks we get.
Yeah.
But then as soon as they leave, of course, it's spring, and all the mowing they've done is non-existent because the grass grows so fast. But,
yeah.
So we do that, and this year we're using some poppy mulch, which is a fantastic sort of. It's a bit of a weed suppressant if you put it on heavy enough. It's not as nutrient rich as compost, but it's definitely got lots of nutrients in it, lots of nitrogen, and so we use that as a bit of a weed suppressant as well as a goodness generator, and it might mean we can get away with a year without using the undivine cultivator, which will help sort of let the soil settle again. And
yeah,
So yeah, everything's done for a reason. If we need to do it, we do it. If we don't need to do it, we don't.
Sure. And as far as the approach in the winery now, you use of oak, that kind of thing, filtrations. You try to limit the addition of sulfurs.
Sulfur relative to what we do. So we do use sulfur, and we use a reasonable amount of it, I guess.
Yeah.
In some of our wines, some of the wines we don't hardly use any, like the Gruner is tiny amounts. We've just released, or just releasing next week, a no added sulfur wine. Just tiny amount of Pinot, because I'm just playing with the idea of how it all works, and it's a bit of an experiment to see how it goes.
Have you had any influences as far as that kind of thing? You get out a bit to sort of to show the wines, and people are sort of talking to you, giving their recommendations, that kind of thing. Is there anyone who kind of gets in your ear about certain things?
No, I'm a good listener.
Yeah.
With those sorts of things, and I believe in some things and don't believe in others.
Sure.
But I think the most important thing that for me that I've learned is that, there isn't another vineyard within sort of 5 kilometres of my house of any volume. So, the most important thing I can do is concentrate on my vineyard, not worry about anyone else's.
Yeah.
I'm never going to make Chablis. I'm never going to make white Burgundy. I'm never going to make red Burgundy.
No.
I need to focus on doing the best with what I've got that I can, without worrying too much about other influences, because it's not going to be the same.
Yeah.
And, part of that is in the last few years, after having played around with them, I've sort of given up on clones.
Okay.
I think it's important to look at the clones relative to how they ripen for your site.
Sure.
But the 3 hectares of new vineyard we planted, we got about 15 or 16 clones and threw them on the floor of the winery and counted them out and planted them. So I don't think it really, I think, for me, the sum of the parts is much more important.
Yeah.
And in some years, the early ripening ones are going to be much better than the late ripening ones, and vice versa in other years in Tassie. And it's about putting it all together.
It's about the balance.
Well, it's about, I think the best wines we make come off 30-year-old vines that we don't know what's actually planted clone-wise.
Right.
So I know they're 30 years old, and the other, the clonal stuff we've got's only 12 years old.
Yeah.
But for me, it's a sum of the parts thing, and it's not really a philosophy; it's a feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And I also believe in treating your vineyard the same way every year.
Yeah. So,
and we do that. We treat every vine relative to its health, rather than, we don't count buds, we don't do any of the sciencey stuff. And in years like 14, when everyone complains about crops, we had the best crop we'd had in about 3 years.
There you go.
So it's not, I'm not qualified to be a winemaker, so I don't play with the science or a viticulturalist. So I treat things the way I feel they should be treated.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's about the relationship with the land and with the vines and with the wine.
Yeah, I think deep down you have to have some feeling to where you are, and we're very lucky. We have a pretty special piece of land in the Tamar Valley that is a pretty warm site, so we're pretty immune to vagaries of the weather.
Yeah. So
we're picking a bit earlier, so if the weather's going a bit funny later in the season, we're okay. And I just think it's about appreciating that. And when, our neighbours have been there for 60 years around us.
Yeah.
And, they're not there anymore, but they were. And to hear them talk about how in the 12 years we've been there, the wildlife that's come back on their property because we're not spraying stuff and doing stuff is I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's quails and there's pheasants have moved in and wombats have moved in. They haven't seen a wombat for 20 years. And
wow,
wombats aren't great from a vineyard. They're not in the vineyard, thankfully, at the moment. But to know that by reducing what you're doing and being conscious of what you're doing, you can you're basically changing the microclimate almost, or ecosystem in the fact that you're bringing in plants and stuff that weren't there.
And you never know.
But should be there, but aren't there anymore.
And who knows? Maybe in a few more years we'll start seeing Tasmanian tigers again.
They saw one in Adelaide a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, I wasn't sure about that, but anyway, Joe, thank you very much for being on the show and for sharing a bit about your journey. Are there ways that people can find out more about the Stoney Rise and Holyman story, and a way that they can follow you as you make more wines and get out and about with them?
Yeah, I guess everything's available on the internet. So the website. Yep. Stoney Rise, and if they're game, they can follow me on social media.
Yeah. What are your accounts?
I think I forget because I've done that very badly. I'm not very good at marketing, strangely enough.
All right.
I've got Stoney Rise on Instagram, Joe Holyman on Facebook, and there is a Stoney Rise Wine Company page on Facebook.
Yep.
And then I think I'm Stoney Rise on Twitter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'll make sure to list them on the posts. But look, it was lovely catching up with you, and looking forward to trying some more wines in the future.
Thanks for having us.
Pleasure. And as always, thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Vincast. I have been James Gaesbrook, also known as the Intrepid Wino, and I'd love for you to follow me on social media. On Instagram and Twitter, you can find me at Intrepid Wino, and you can also follow the podcast at the Vincast. I'd love for you to like my Facebook page, where you can see some pictures and some links that I share on there. And why not visit my YouTube channel, Intrepid Wino, all one word, and check out some of the videos that I post there. Subscribe and like and comment and share. I'd love for you to subscribe to the podcast on any number of different podcast hosting apps and programs, including iTunes, Stitcher, Player FM, Podbean. Subscribing, as mentioned at the start of the episode, means you get the newest episode as soon as it becomes available, and you can get access to all 100 plus episodes that I've already released. As always, I'd love for you to visit me at intrepidwino.com, where you can see all the different videos, podcasts and writings that I've done in the past, and you can find out how to get in touch with me there. I'd love for you to join me on future episodes. Got some great guests coming, but until then, bye.